Hi, everybody, and welcome to Social Disorganization Theory. Social Disorganization Theory was authored by two theorists named Sean McKay, and this was written in the early 1940s. The idea of social disorganization theory is when theorists shifted away from internal or social influences and looked at the environment. How does the environment drive criminality, drive criminal behavior? And within the context of social disorganization, I mean, it sort of says it in the title of the theory, is that if you live in an area that is socially disorganized, and we'll formally define that, if you live in it, but if you live in an area that has a lot of social disorganization, there's going to be a lot of crime, and it's that social disorganization, that decay of the community and the environmental locale is going to produce more crime with more decay. The formal definition of social disorganization is defined as the inability of local communities to realize common values and the inability for their residents to solve commonly experienced problems. Okay, so what does that look like? Let me tell you what that looks like. And then I'm going to tell you what causes social disorganization. But you can see social disorganization. You can visually see it, right? You can compare it to neighborhoods that are organized, and they are wildly different. Neighborhoods with organization, neighbors know each other. They're clean. They don't have refuse. They don't have graffiti. They don't have abandoned buildings or abandoned cars. They don't have derelict buildings that are falling apart. People know each other. People informally police their own living space. So if they see a child or somebody doing something illegal or damaging to the community, they call the police, or they might say, hey, knock it off. Whereas socially disorganized neighborhoods are going to be characterized by all of the opposite issues, right? That you can literally see the decline. You can see the graffiti. You can see buildings falling down. You can see homeless people living in these buildings. You can see people using drugs on the street and in these buildings. There are drug dealers on the street corner, and nobody stops them from drug dealing. It's just a part of the environment. It becomes an accepted part of day-to-day life. Excuse me. So what causes social disorganization? So there's three elements, according to Sean McKay, that create social disorganization in an environment. And the first one is going to be what we call residential instability or residential mobility. And what that means is people don't stay. People don't stay. There's a lot of people moving in and out of a given geographic locale. And why is that a problem? Well, because if people are constantly moving in and out, they never develop ties to the community. They may not even develop ties to the building in which they're living, whether it's a house or an apartment. It's just kind of like, hey, this is temporary. This is not my home. I'm not going to be here that long. I don't need to get to know people. I don't need to take care of this area in which I live. If I see somebody breaking the law, it's not my problem because I'm not going to be here soon. Right, I'm going to move somewhere else. So when you have people constantly coming in and out of a neighborhood and high residential mobility, you just have a lack of investment in the community. In addition, this residential, what Sean McKay said sparked residential mobility and what sparked social disorganization, which largely exists in urban locales, is ultimately that, in the past, in the 60s and the 70s ish, there used to be a good tax base in the city because you had all kinds of people living in the city. You had wealthy people, you had middle class people, you had poor people, you had people of all races, you had people of all religions. But somewhere along the way, the tax base left when there was residential mobility, specifically when there was white flight, is what it's called, is when more affluent white people who were middle class or upper class were living in the cities, but moved out to the suburbs when the suburbs became a thing, right? People used to gravitate to the cities because that's where all the work was. So people lived there, people of all economic strata and backgrounds. But with the advent of cars and cheap energy and cheap electricity and so forth and cheap fuel, gasoline, people say, hey, you know what? We don't need to live in the city anymore. We can live in the suburbs and we can commute to our jobs, right? And we can do it rather cheaply. So we saw the people with the means to do that flood the city. And largely the people with the means to do that were middle class white people and upper class white people, which is why they call it white flight. When those people left, they took their tax base with them, right? Their tax base goes to support the suburbs that they now live in. Which means if the middle class and the upper class are fleeing the cities, what's left? You have the lower class. Now you have a much smaller tax base, right? And remember, taxes support our local institutions like policing, um, things that keep society organized, keep society safe. Education, right? If you have a lower tax base, those things are going to be less effective. They're going to be smaller. They're going to have fewer resources. And ultimately, that's going to have a cumulative effect. If all the kids in a given area are getting a really subpar education, well, first of all, they're not going to go to college. They're not going to go and get a trade. They're going to find illegal ways of earning a living. If there's not adequate funding for policing in the area because there's a low tax base, well, there's a lower police presence, which gives crime more of an ability to flourish, right? So this all becomes a cycle, this residential mobility. And when the middle class and the wealthy classes took their tax base with them, residential mobility and that lack of being tied to the community results in social disorganization. The second postulate, according to Sean McKay, are racial and ethnic heterogeneity. And what that means is just a diverse population, right? People from different races, people with different subcultural backgrounds, people with different languages, right? And that's, again, you're going to see that a lot in urban locations where there's going to be a little Italy and there's going to be a Chinatown and there's going to be a little Somalia. And, where there's going to be a lot of different ethnic groups, religious groups, and different races living in a small area, right? They're all, in this small area of the city, and they're all very, very different, which means they don't necessarily have the same interests. They don't necessarily communicate the same way because they have different languages, and that causes discord. It also keeps people from making community relations because you're from that group, I'm from this group, I can't communicate with you, I'm going to stay over here with what's familiar to me. So there's no community bonds that are being built when you've got a large amount of racial and ethnic heterogeneity. If you don't have social bonds being built, then you have people isolating to different groups, which means you don't have a community that battles social problems together, right? And the third and final element of social disorganization is poverty. Poverty. We already talked about the tax base leaving with the middle and upper class movement out to the suburbs. But without them, without the middle class, without the upper class, not only do we not have a tax base, but they take their small businesses with them. Local businesses aren't getting patronized the way they used to because there's simply not as many people who used to live here with means to come and buy things at your company or your small business or your store or to eat at your restaurant, or what have you. So there's less patronization going on of local businesses, which means you're going to have more poverty. People are making less money. And again, as poverty increases, people who have the means will leave the area, which really results in concentrated poverty, right? It's not just poverty. So even some people who may be in what we define as poverty might be able to leave, go to a suburban area, go to a rural area. And what they're leaving behind is not just poverty, but the worst poverty, the lowest poverty, the most intense poverty that literally can't afford to leave the city. So Shaw and McKay argue when you have that combination of three things, you've got residential instability, you've got racial and ethnic heterogeneity, and you've got poverty, you're going to result with social disorganization. You're going to have a group of people that don't have the means to stimulate a business and provide or have business flourish. The tax base is too low to provide funding for the institutions that keep society organized and safe and positive. Different groups are going to break off and sort of keep to themselves, which means there's no community investment for everybody to sort of work together to fight to keep the neighborhood clean and safe and not vandalized and to not have drug dealers and prostitutes walking around. And what you end up with is social disorganization. So major policy implications here are, again, to find alternatives to incarceration and crime control, because the more social disorganization you have, the more crime you have, which means people in this area are going to get arrested, which means you're going to be removing a certain segment of the population consistently to incarcerate them as a consequence of their arrest. When you're doing that, all you're doing is concentrating poverty even more, because now there's one less person in the household for the next 8 years. There's one less income, right? You're concentrating poverty further, and it becomes a downward spiral. And it is very difficult when a place becomes socially disorganized, and when it really concentrates, it's very difficult to break that cycle, and it's very difficult to revitalize that location. Now, it's possible. Philadelphia has done it in several locations, and they've done it successfully, taken areas that were questionable, that were sketchy, that were run down, and they have revitalized them with doing facelifts on the buildings and putting construction in and putting small businesses in, and there have been some that have come back. But when there is a really, really heavy presence of social disorganization, it's very difficult to battle that once it's set in. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we stop some of this social disorganization? Well, let's stop taking people out of the community with incarceration, maybe use diversionary programs as consequences so they can still have a job, still earn a living, still contribute to the household, and not concentrate poverty so heavily. Let's introduce educational programs to supplement public education, because the public education simply isn't getting it done in that area. They don't have the tax base to provide the education that people need and deserve. So supplementary educational programs, youth athletic leagues, right? Community service clubs, things of that nature, summer camps, things that build community, things that give young people ties to the community, that begin young, that they can grow and develop as they get older, in that location and in that area, so that there is community investment from the people who live there. And people do know each other, right? People who know each other are more likely to communicate and say, hey, somebody's been breaking into cars this week, make sure you lock your car door, or make sure they're more likely to communicate when there's a crime problem, and they're more likely to be able to manage it because of that communication. So this leads us to the next step, or the next iteration or development in the social disorganization timeline, and that is what we call collective efficacy. And collective efficacy is a theory that was put forth by Robert Sampson, and he basically just took social disorganization and he took it a step further. And basically he said, look, in order to combat social disorganization and for social disorganization to not exist, we need to develop collective efficacy in these neighborhoods. What does that mean? Well, it means that the neighborhood residents need to be invested. They need to be invested in the area that they live. It needs to be home. It needs to be important to them, which means we got to slow down residential mobility, because otherwise nobody's, going to become invested, right? People need to know each other. Neighbors need to know each other. Don't isolate to your groups, right? In order to have collective efficacy, people need to know each other so that when there is a problem, you can communicate it. Or maybe you're the one having the problem, you can ask for help, right? And neighbors and communities help each other. When you build up or strengthen collective efficacy, social disorganization and social decline will begin to minimize. If you can get people invested, to take pride, to get to know each other, say, hey, this is my house, pick that up, do not throw the garbage there. Nope, you guys who are over here tagging, this is where we live, you're not going to do this. And hey, there's prostitution over here and there's drug dealers. I'm calling the police because this is my home and I don't want prostitutes and drug dealers 2 doors down from my house. Right, that they start getting invested, which makes them proactive. It makes them proactive in battling the decay, and basically putting up boundaries and structures and guidelines to say, not in this neighborhood, we don't tolerate it. Right, but when everybody's isolated to their own specific groups and nobody's communicating, people just kind of like, well, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, right? Versus if you know each other and you can help each other, you put down those guidelines and boundaries. And also there's just less stress, right? When you know your neighbors and your neighbors help, you can help each other out, versus you don't know anybody and you hit a problem and you can't ask anybody for help. I had a neighborhood that had amazing collective efficacy and I was so grateful for it. I was a young mom, I didn't have much help. My husband was traveling a lot for work, and things would happen. And I had, a couple of great neighbors I could pick up the phone and call and say, can you watch my kid for like a half an hour while I go to the grocery store? Can you, our refrigerator died. I know you have one in your garage. Could we borrow it for 2 weeks until our new fridge comes? Imagine if you didn't have people to reach out to and ask for help. Imagine the stress in your life that becomes cumulative. And we know under high rates of poverty and high rates of stress, what happens? Crime happens. Whether it's you're frustrated and you're angry and you're lashing out physically and you get into aggravated assaults, or you bleed into illegal methods of obtaining money to obtain your new refrigerator, etc. Right? When you have that community and you have that support network, there's less stress, there's more help, and there's cohesion in the community. And then when there's cohesion in the community, you all sort of band together and you will not tolerate social disorganization. It gets forced out. So according to Robert Sampson, that is the cure to social disorganization, is higher, strong, increased collective efficacy.